If you've never worked graveyard shift at an isolated gas station, it's hard to explain the specific kind of quiet that settles over the place around 2 a.m. It's heavy, expectant, like the building itself is holding its breath. But the night of the blizzard, that quiet was suffocating. I was 19, working the overnight shift at Miller's to pay my way through college. Miller's was a run-down, cinder-block store sitting on a forgotten stretch of state highway, miles from the nearest town. We had 4 pumps and a buzzing neon sign, surrounded by nothing but dense woods. They'd been warning about a historic storm all week, but you never think it's going to be that bad. By 11 p.m., the snow was coming down so fast I couldn't even see the highway. A complete whiteout. The wind sounded like a freight train, rattling the large plate glass windows at the front. Inside, it was a sharp, uncomfortable contrast. The harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, the smell of stale, burnt coffee on the bun warmer, and the rhythmic, metallic hum of the refrigerated coolers. Around midnight, the harsh door chime made me jump. Ding dong! A massive county snowplow had pulled in, its amber lights painting the swirling snow orange. The driver, a grizzled guy in a heavy Carhartt jacket, stomped his boots on the linoleum. He brought the smell of wet wool, diesel fuel, and freezing air with him. He bought 2 packs of Marlboros and a large black coffee. As I handed him his change, he didn't turn to leave. He just looked at me, his face pale and dead serious. "You're the only one here?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Just me," I nodded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He looked out the front windows into the swirling, chaotic white. "County dispatch is pulling us off the roads. It's too dangerous even for the plows. State police are closing the highway past the ridge." He looked back at me, his eyes locked onto mine. "Nobody else is coming through here tonight, kid. Keep your doors locked and don't go outside for any reason. If you get stuck out there, you're dead." He pushed through the glass doors back into the freezing void. The door shut behind him, cutting off the howl of the wind. I watched his plow rumble back onto the invisible highway, its amber lights quickly swallowed completely by the whiteout. Then, it was just me. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the buzzing of the lights and the rattling of the glass. The weather radio behind the counter was emitting a low, rhythmic static. I reached for my cell phone to text my roommate, but the screen confirmed what I already suspected. No service. The storm had completely knocked out the nearest tower. A knot of genuine anxiety formed in my stomach. I picked up the store's landline, the heavy beige plastic receiver feeling cold against my ear. Nothing. No dial tone. Just dead, empty air. I was completely cut off from the rest of the world. Just me, trapped in a brightly lit glass box in the middle of a frozen wasteland. I went about my duties, wiping down the counters, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of claustrophobia. I'd almost convinced myself to calm down when I saw them. About an hour after the plow left, at exactly 1:14 a.m., the faint, blurry glow of headlights pierced through the blizzard. A beat-up, dark-colored sedan slowly rolled into the station's lot, the engine barely audible over the wind. It didn't pull up to the pumps. It bypassed them entirely, coasting to a slow, deliberate stop right at the edge of the illumination from the canopy, facing the store. The headlights abruptly cut out. And then, nobody got out.
10 minutes. That's how long the beat-up sedan just sat there in the blinding snow. I checked the digital clock on the register over and over, watching the red numbers tick by. 1:15, 1:19, 1:24. If you've never stared at a dark, motionless car in an empty parking lot at 2 in the morning, you don't know how fast your own mind can turn against you. My brain ran through every rational explanation. They're checking a map. They're waiting out the worst of the snow. They fell asleep, but none of it felt right. The engine was completely off. In sub-zero temperatures, with wind chills plummeting into the negatives, turning off your heater in the middle of a historic blizzard was practically a death sentence. I stood completely still behind the counter, my right hand resting near the heavy metal Maglite flashlight we kept tucked under the register tray. The harsh fluorescent lights of the store suddenly felt less like a beacon of safety and more like a spotlight. I was fully illuminated inside a glass box, and whoever was out there in the dark had a perfect, unobstructed view of me. At 1:25 a.m., the driver's side door finally groaned open. A figure stepped out into the howling storm. Even through the swirling whiteout and the distorted, snow-caked glass of the front doors, I could tell something was profoundly wrong. He wasn't dressed for the weather. No heavy winter parka, no gloves, no hat, just a dark, tattered hoodie pulled up over his head and a thin, filthy denim jacket. He moved with a strange, jerky cadence, his shoulders hunched, his head twitching rapidly from side to side as he fought the bitter wind. He didn't look at the gas pumps. He walked in a direct, deliberate line toward the front doors. Ding dong! The cheerful electronic chime of the door sensor echoed through the dead quiet store, loud as a gunshot. A blast of freezing air and a violent flurry of snow rushed in with him before the heavy glass door slammed shut, slicing off the howl of the blizzard once again. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. The man stood on the welcome mat, dripping melting snow onto the cracked linoleum. He was rail-thin, almost skeletal, and shaking violently, though whether from the freezing cold or something else I couldn't tell. Underneath the hood, his face was gaunt, his skin a sickly pale yellow under the buzzing overhead lights. But it was his eyes that made my stomach drop into my shoes. They were wide, bloodshot, and completely unblinking. They didn't dart around the store looking for the coffee station or the restrooms. They locked instantly, magnetically onto me. "Welcome to Miller's," I managed to say. My voice cracked. It sounded pathetic, hollow, and weak. He didn't answer. His jaw clamped tightly shut, grinding rhythmically, the muscles in his hollow cheeks twitching with the motion. He just stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds before taking a step forward. His wet, ruined boots made a heavy, squelching thud against the floor. He didn't walk down the main center aisle. He hugged the far right wall, dragging his bare, filthy hand along the glass of the beverage coolers, leaving a long, greasy streak of condensation in his wake. He moved slowly, deliberately, making his way to the very back corner of the store, the aisle with the motor oil and automotive supplies, furthest from the register and partially obscured by a tall cardboard promotional display. I pretended to organize the candy bars by the register, trying desperately to project a sense of calm I absolutely didn't feel. I kept casting sideways, panicked glances toward the convex security mirror mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling. What I saw in that curved mirror made the blood freeze in my veins. He wasn't looking at the motor oil. He wasn't browsing. He was standing perfectly still at the end of the aisle, half hidden in the shadows, his body angled entirely toward the front counter. His head was tilted down, but through the distorted curve of the mirror I could see his bloodshot eyes staring directly at my reflection. He was just watching me. And then, from the back of the store, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators, I heard a sound that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. He was humming. A slow, discordant, breathy tune that had no melody, just a rhythmic, mocking drone. I reached under the counter and wrapped my sweating fingers around a cold, heavy steel of the flashlight. We were the only 2 people alive in this frozen world, and I knew with absolute certainty he wasn't here to buy anything. The humming scraped against my eardrums like a rusted blade. It wasn't a song. It was just a rhythmic, wet, vibrating noise originating deep in the back of his throat, completely out of sync with the tinny pop music softly piping through the store's ceiling speakers. I kept my grip tight on the heavy metal flashlight under the counter, my knuckles turning white. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I was terrified he could hear it from 40 feet away. I forced myself to look away from the convex security mirror and down at the counter. Act normal, I told myself. Act like this is just a weird guy getting out of the cold. I grabbed a rag and a bottle of blue glass cleaner and started aggressively wiping down the already spotless countertop next to the lottery tickets. "Hey, man," I called out over the noise of the coolers. My voice was louder this time, sharper. I aimed for a tone that was retail worker polite but firm. "Let me know if you need help finding anything back there. Bathroom is out of order, by the way." The humming stopped instantly. The sudden silence inside the store was heavy and suffocating. The only sounds left were the relentless howling wind slamming against the front plate glass and the mechanical thrum of the refrigerators. I glanced back up at the security mirror in the corner. He hadn't moved an inch. His head was still tilted down, his skeletal frame still half hidden by a cardboard display of cheap sunglasses, but those wide, bloodshot eyes were still locked onto my reflection. He didn't answer my question. He didn't acknowledge I had spoken at all. Sweat prickled at my hairline despite the drafty chill creeping in from the front doors. I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "Sir?" I tried again, my voice trembling just a fraction. "We're technically supposed to lock the doors during whiteout conditions. Are you buying something, or—" He finally moved, but not toward the register. He stepped out from behind the sunglasses display and began to pace. He walked down the back aisle, his wet boots making a heavy, sickening squelch thud on the linoleum. He reached the end of the aisle, turned on his heel with jerky, unnatural speed, and paced back. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring the rows of chips and automotive supplies. Back and forth, like a caged, starving animal burning off nervous, violent energy. Every time he reached the end of the aisle, he would pause for a fraction of a second, his neck twitching violently before snapping his body around to pace the other way. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down my spine. The instinct to bolt was overwhelming, but bolt where? Outside was a frozen, disorienting void where the temperature was dropping to -20. The nearest house was 5 miles down a buried highway. My old sedan was thoroughly snowed in behind the dumpster. I was trapped in this brightly lit fishbowl. I slowly released the flashlight, keeping it within arm's reach, and slid my shaking hand over to the landline phone again. I knew it was dead. I had checked it just 20 minutes ago. But the human brain craves a lifeline in a panic. I picked up the heavy beige receiver and pressed it to my ear, hiding my hand behind the tall register monitor so the pacing man couldn't see. Nothing. Just the hollow, mocking hiss of a dead line. I hung it up gently, a profound sense of helplessness washing over me. As I pulled my hand away, my eyes drifted past the pacing man in the mirror and out toward the front windows. The storm was a chaotic, swirling wall of white, obscuring everything beyond the first row of gas pumps. The canopy lights barely pierced the gloom. But as a massive gust of wind momentarily shifted, violently parting the heavy curtain of snow for just a second, my breath hitched in my throat. Out by the very edge of the canopy's fading light, standing right next to the dark, beat-up sedan, there was someone else. It was a tall, broad-shouldered figure wrapped in a heavy, dark winter coat. They weren't moving toward the store. They weren't trying to get out of the cold or checking the car's engine. They were just standing there in the raging blizzard, completely rigid, facing the plate glass windows of the gas station. Me. And as I stared at this motionless silhouette in the whiteout, the squelching footsteps inside the store suddenly stopped. My breath caught in my throat, choking off whatever customer service platitude I was about to force out. I blinked hard, praying my exhausted brain was just manifesting shadows in the swirling whiteout. But as the wind howled and the heavy snow whipped around the gas pumps, the silhouette remained completely stationary. It wasn't a trick of the light. There was a second person out there, standing in -20-degree weather without moving a muscle, just watching the store. Before I could even process the sheer impossibility of someone surviving out in that cold, my attention was violently yanked back inside. The squelching footsteps had resumed. He wasn't pacing the back aisle anymore. The heavy, wet thud squelch was moving down the center aisle, straight toward the register, straight toward me. I forced my eyes away from the plate glass windows and looked at the man inside. He was moving with that same jerky, unnatural cadence, but his speed had noticeably increased. As he stepped out from the harsh shadows of the back aisles and into the glaring, unobstructed light of the front counter, the sheer wrongness of him hit me in a physical wave. He smelled like old copper, stale sweat, and something sickly sweet like rotting fruit. His thin denim jacket was soaked through, clinging to his skeletal frame, but he wasn't shivering anymore. His jaw was still grinding relentlessly, the muscles jumping beneath his pale, sallow skin. I took a slow half-step backward, ensuring the heavy mag light was perfectly aligned with my right hand beneath the counter ledge. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Hey," I managed to say. It came out as a breathless croak. I cleared my throat, dragging my trembling fingers across the register keyboard. You're finding everything okay? Like I said earlier, the roads are closed. You probably want to grab some water or something before you head back out." He stopped exactly 2 feet from the counter. The bright fluorescent light beat down on him, illuminating the deep, dark circles under his unblinking, bloodshot eyes. He didn't look at the candy displays. He didn't look at the lottery tickets. He just stared at my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Up close, his pupils were dilated so wide they almost swallowed his irises entirely. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the wind screaming against the building and the heavy rattling of the glass doors. I waited for him to demand the cash drawer. I waited for him to pull a weapon. I braced my legs, ready to swing the heavy metal flashlight at the first sudden movement. Instead, he slowly leaned forward over the counter. He tilted his head, his neck popping audibly with the motion, and finally opened his mouth. "He says you're lying," the man whispered. His voice was raspy, completely devoid of emotion, and barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the refrigerators. I froze, my grip tightening on the flashlight until my knuckles physically ached. "Excuse me?" The man didn't blink. He slowly raised a trembling, dirt-caked finger and pointed blindly over his shoulder, directly toward the front plate glass windows, toward the howling blizzard and the dark, stationary silhouette waiting by the pumps. "He says you aren't alone in here," the drifter hissed, his face splitting into a wide, unnatural smile. "So where are you hiding them?"
"I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. My knuckles were white around the heavy metal barrel of the flashlight hidden beneath the counter. "It's just me here, I swear to God." The drifter's grotesque, unnatural smile didn't waver. His wide, bloodshot eyes seemed to vibrate in their sunken sockets. "No, no, no," he mocked, his raspy voice taking on a sickeningly playful sing-song rhythm. He told me they're sleeping in the ice, but you won't let us wake them up, will you?" He leaned further over the counter, his filthy hands gripping the laminate edge so hard his knuckles popped. The smell of stale sweat, wet denim, and rotting fruit washed over me in a suffocating wave. He was invading my space, his twitching, sallow face mere inches from the plexiglass lottery display. "Sir, I need you to step back," I commanded. It was supposed to sound authoritative, but the tremor in my chest betrayed me. It came out as a terrified plea. Instead of stepping back, he slammed his open palms down on the counter. Smack! The sound was violently loud against the backdrop of the howling storm. "Open the back room," he whispered, the manic smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a look of pure, feral rage. "Let us into the warm." That was it. The very last thread of retail worker obligation snapped. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct took over. At Miller's stop, the main register was exposed, but immediately behind it sat a heavy-duty security booth, a heavy-duty, bullet-resistant cage where the manager counted the cash during the day. It had a thick steel door, a heavy deadbolt, and walls lined with reinforced steel mesh. Keeping the heavy mag light raised, I refused to turn my back on him. I took one slow step backwards, then another. The drifter's head tilted, watching me retreat like a starving dog watching wounded prey. He didn't try to vault the counter, but his jaw started grinding again, faster and harder this time.
I reached blindly behind me, my trembling fingers finding the cold metal handle of the booth door. I yanked it open, threw myself backwards into the cramped, dimly lit space, and slammed the heavy door shut. I threw the deadbolt across with a deafening metallic clack. I collapsed against the heavy metal drop safe, my chest heaving, gasping for air as if I'd just sprinted a mile. I was locked in. I was safe. Or so I tried to tell myself. I looked through the thick, scratched security glass of the booth. The drifter hadn't moved from the counter. He was staring directly at the locked door of my cage. Then, slowly, he raised a single dirt-caked finger and pressed it against the glass. He began to tap, 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 a slow, horrifying, rhythmic beat that echoed through the empty store. Desperate for any kind of situational awareness, I spun toward the small bank of security monitors tucked into the corner of the booth. The screens were grainy, black and white, and heavily distorted by the blizzard blowing across the external lenses. I slapped the button for camera 2, the feed covering the front gas pumps and the dark sedan. My breath caught in my throat. The second figure was still out there in the swirling whiteout, but they were no longer standing by the car. They had moved. The broad-shouldered silhouette was now standing directly under the bright, buzzing light of the main canopy, just a few feet from the front glass doors. And even through the heavy static of the monitor, I could see they weren't looking into the store. They were staring straight up, directly into the lens of the security camera, staring right at me. Before I could even process the creeping terror of that realization, the steady mechanical hum of the store's refrigerator suddenly stuttered. Above me, the harsh, bright fluorescent lights emitted a violent electrical crack. They dimmed to a sickly, pulsing orange, plunging the entire store into heavy shadows for 3 terrifying seconds before loudly buzzing back to a harsh white. The ice was weighing down the lines. The power grid was failing.
When the lights surged back to life, the loud electrical buzz of the fluorescent tubes sounded like a death rattle. The heavy compressors of the refrigeration units shuddered, whining in protest as they struggled to restart. I stood frozen in the cramped security booth, my back pressed hard against the cold metal of the drop safe. The power grid was hanging by a thread. If the lines went down completely, the cameras would die, the canopy lights would die. I would be plunged into absolute blinding darkness with a lunatic on the other side of my door and an unknown accomplice waiting in the blizzard. The small, reinforced cage suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a coffin. Tap, tap, tap. The sound jerked my attention away from the ceiling. The drifter was still standing at the main counter, his dirt-caked fingers striking the thick, scratched glass of my booth. But his expression had shifted. The feral rage from a moment ago had melted into a look of rapt, childlike fascination. He tilted his head, listening to the struggling, uneven hum of the store's electricity. He let out a dry, hacking laugh that sounded like tearing heavy canvas. "The ice," he rasped, his voice carrying easily through the small circular mesh vents of the booth. "It's biting the wires. It's coming inside." He finally pulled his finger away from the glass. Instead of trying the heavy deadbolt on my door, he turned his back to me and began to wander down the center aisle. His gait was less jerky now, replaced by a slow, predatory stroll. I watched him through the security window as he disappeared behind the tall shelves of potato chips, heading toward the back of the store. My heart hammered in my throat. I spun around to the bank of security monitors. I slapped the button for camera 2, desperate to keep an eye on the broad-shouldered silhouette outside. The screen flickered with heavy static, displaying the snowy expanse beneath the illuminated canopy. The figure was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. "No, no, no," I muttered, my hands shaking violently as I jammed the buttons for the other external feeds. Camera 3 covered the side parking lot, nothing but a swirling, chaotic wall of whiteout. Camera 4 pointed at the rear dumpsters, empty, just violent drifts of snow piling against the brick. They were gone. Or worse, they were in a blind spot right against the exterior walls.
I frantically switched to the internal feeds to find the drifter. Camera 6 covered the automotive aisle. There he was. He was standing in front of a small end cap display of emergency car supplies. He wasn't twitching anymore. He was entirely still, methodically running his pale hands over the merchandise. He bypassed the jumper cables. He ignored the plastic ice scrapers. He reached down to the bottom shelf and picked up a heavy, solid steel 4-way lug wrench. He tested its weight, slapping the cold, heavy iron against his open palm. Smack, smack, smack. Then he turned and looked directly up into the lens of camera 6. That sickening wide smile stretched across his gaunt face once again. Before my exhausted brain could even process what he was planning, a thunderous, violent crash echoed from the front of the store, so incredibly loud I physically flinched away from the monitors. I whipped my head toward the front plate glass windows. Standing just inches from the other side of the glass, completely illuminated by the harsh indoor lights, was the second figure. They were wearing a heavy, dark, snow-caked ski mask, obscuring all their features. They weren't just watching anymore. They had both thick, gloved hands planted flat against the glass, pushing violently against the locked double doors, rattling the heavy aluminum frame in its tracks. And inside the store, the drifter was walking out of the automotive aisle, the heavy steel lug wrench swinging loosely at his side, heading straight for the front entrance to let them in.
Through the thick security glass of my cage, I watched my nightmare unfold in excruciating slow motion. I slammed my hands against the plexiglass window of the booth, the sound muffled and pathetic. "Hey, don't do it! Get away from the door!" I screamed, my voice raw and tearing at my throat. The drifter didn't even flinch. He walked with a terrifying, purposeful stride down the center aisle, the heavy steel lug wrench swinging rhythmically against his thigh. At the front entrance, the masked figure suddenly stopped rattling the aluminum frame. They stood perfectly still, a towering, snow-covered monolith waiting on the other side of the glass, entirely unbothered by the deadly sub-zero wind lashing at their back. The drifter reached the double doors. He didn't look back at me. With a sickeningly casual motion, he reached out and turned the brass thumb turn of the heavy deadbolt. Click. The wind didn't just blow the doors open, it violently tore them inward. A localized hurricane of blinding white snow and agonizingly cold air exploded into the store. A spinning rack of cheap sunglasses near the entrance was instantly knocked flat, sending plastic frames skittering across the wet linoleum like dying insects. The temperature inside the store plummeted so fast I could instantly see my own panicked breath fogging up the inside of my reinforced window. The masked figure stepped over the threshold. Up close, the sheer, imposing size of the second man was paralyzing. He was easily 6'4", bundled in a dark, heavy surplus-style parka that made his shoulders look impossibly wide. Solid sheets of melting ice clung to the black knit of his ski mask, freezing over the fabric. He didn't twitch, he didn't hum. He possessed a terrifying, absolute stillness that stood in horrifying contrast to the drifter's manic, jerky energy. The drifter practically shrank as the giant entered the harsh fluorescent light. He took a subservient step back, his head bowing slightly, his jaw grinding 1,000,000 miles an hour. "He's in the cage," the drifter giggled, a wet, breathless sound. He pointed a dirt-caked finger straight at my booth. "He won't share the warm." The masked figure slowly reached out with a thick leather-gloved hand and shoved the glass doors shut, latching the deadbolt. He cut off the violent roar of the blizzard, trapping us all together. The heavy silence that rushed back in was infinitely worse. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the store as the masked man began to walk toward the main counter. Each step of his massive winter boots was calculated and heavy enough to rattle the cans of soup on the adjacent shelves. I retreated as far back into the booth as physically possible, pressing my spine into the freezing steel of the drop safe. My hands gripped the heavy maglite so hard my joints screamed in protest. The plexiglass window was thick, but looking at the solid iron of the lug wrench, I suddenly doubted it would hold.
The giant stopped just 3 feet from my booth. He stared down at me through the smeared glass, his eyes completely hidden in the dark, recessed shadows of his wet ski mask. He didn't say a word. He just slowly raised his gloved hand and tapped the glass. Once, a heavy, booming thud. Then he held his open hand out toward his companion. The drifter scrambled forward like an obedient dog and placed the heavy 4-way steel lug wrench into the giant's waiting palm. The masked figure gripped the center of the iron cross. He pulled his right arm back, his massive shoulders shifting under his heavy coat, winding up for a devastating full-force swing aimed dead center at my window. I squeezed my eyes shut, raised my arms over my head and braced for the shatter. And at that exact second, the fluorescent lights overhead emitted one final, agonizing pop. The store plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness.
The absolute absence of light hit me like a physical blow. 1 second I was bathed in the harsh, sterile glare of the fluorescent tubes, bracing for a shower of broken glass. The next, I was swallowed by a darkness so complete, so suffocatingly thick, it felt like I had been buried alive. With the power dead, the relentless metallic hum of the commercial refrigerators ground to a nauseating halt. The electronic pop music piping through the ceiling speakers vanished. The only sound left in the entire world was the muffled, chaotic scream of the blizzard outside. And then came the impact. Boom! It wasn't the tinkling crash of shattered glass. It was a deafening, structural explosion that vibrated through my boots and rattled my teeth. The heavy steel of the lug wrench had slammed dead center into the booth's reinforced window. The entire cage shuddered violently. A shower of fine dust and loose ceiling tiles rained down on my head in the pitch black. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my back slamming hard against the metal drop safe. My ears were ringing so loudly I could barely hear my own hyperventilating gasps. It held, I realized with a jolt of hysterical relief. The plexiglass hadn't given way. But out in the dark, I heard the heavy squeak of rubber boots shifting on the linoleum. He was repositioning his footing. He was winding up for a second swing. My trembling fingers tightened around the heavy, cold aluminum barrel of the maglite. I had to see. If the glass gave way in the dark, I wouldn't even know where the fatal blow was coming from. I raised the heavy flashlight with both hands, aimed it directly at where I knew the window was, and slammed my thumb down on the rubber switch. Click. A blinding, razor-sharp beam of LED white light sliced through the suffocating blackness of the store. Dust motes swirled like snow in the harsh beam. The light hit the security window. The thick polycarbonate hadn't shattered, but it was mortally wounded. A massive, opaque spiderweb of fractured plastic radiated out from a pulverized white crater in the exact center of the glass. Behind that terrifying web of fractures, the giant was illuminated in stark, horrific relief. The sudden beam of the flashlight didn't even make him blink. His broad, snow-covered chest heaved slowly as he pulled the heavy steel cross back over his shoulder, the muscles in his thick neck straining under the wet ski mask. Next to him, half hidden in the shadows cast by the flashlight's game, the drifter was pressed flat against the glass. He had both hands splayed wide on the window, his sallow face pressed so hard against the cracked plastic that his nose was squashed flat. He was staring unblinkingly into the beam of my flashlight, his wide, dilated eyes shining like a cornered animal's. "Again," the drifter whispered, his raspy voice slithering through the small circular mesh vents of my cage. "Hit it again." Boom! The second strike was even harder. The reinforced window bowed inward with a sickening creak. A sharp, jagged shard of plastic splintered off the inside of the window and shot across the tiny booth, slicing a hot, stinging line across my cheek. The spiderweb of cracks doubled in size, turning the entire window into a frosted, unstable mess. The heavy metal doorframe groaned, the thick hinges slightly warping under the immense kinetic force. It wasn't going to hold another direct hit. One more swing with that heavy iron cross, and the center of the window was going to cave in completely.
I dropped the flashlight to my side, grabbing the barrel of the heavy metal cylinder like a baseball bat. I braced my feet against the safe, ready to swing at the first thing that shoved its way through the breaking glass. The giant slowly pulled his arm back for the third and final strike. But as the flashlight dipped, casting erratic shadows on the floor, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The drifter was no longer pressed against the glass. He had dropped to his hands and knees. He was crawling toward the bottom corner of the booth, his sickeningly wide smile visible in the ambient scatter of the light. He wasn't waiting for the glass to break. He was reaching his long, wiry, dirt-caked arm directly toward the small, heavy-gauge steel pass-through slot at the bottom of the door, the slot we used to slide cash drops through, which I had forgotten to latch. And his impossibly long fingers were reaching up on the inside of the door, stretching blindly toward the brass thumb turn of the deadbolt.
The pale, dirt-caked fingers wriggled blindly through the heavy steel slot at the bottom of the door, scraping against the smooth metal interior. The drifter's arm was shoved in up to the elbow, his hand twisting frantically upward toward the brass thumb turn of the deadbolt. He was inches away. If he managed to flip that lock, the heavy door would swing open and the cage would become my slaughterhouse. I didn't think. There was no time for rational thought, only the cold, hard spike of pure adrenaline. I gripped the heavy, solid aluminum barrel of the maglite with both hands, raised it high above my head, and brought it down like a sledgehammer directly onto the exposed wrist trapped in the narrow steel slot. Crack! The sickening sound of snapping bone was horrifyingly loud, cutting clean through the muffled howl of the blizzard outside. A high-pitched, inhuman shriek erupted from the dark store. It didn't sound like a man. It sounded like an animal being fed through a wood chipper. The drifter violently yanked his arm backward, tearing his own skin on the sharp steel edges of the pass-through. Warm, dark liquid sprayed through the vent, smelling sharply of old pennies, splattering across the toes of my boots and the floor of the booth. The drifter collapsed out of sight, wailing and thrashing in the pitch black. But the giant didn't even flinch at his companion's agony. Illuminated by the erratic beam of my flashlight, the masked behemoth simply planted his heavy boots, pulled his shoulders back, and delivered the third strike. Boom! Crash! The center of the reinforced polycarbonate window finally gave way. It didn't shatter into tiny pieces like normal glass. It tore inward in thick, jagged, frosted chunks. The immense kinetic force of the blow tore the heavy steel lug wrench completely out of the giant's hands, sending it clattering uselessly into the dark aisles behind him. But the damage was catastrophic. A jagged, gaping hole, roughly the size of a microwave oven, now existed dead center in my only line of defense. The heavy impact knocked me backward, causing the flashlight to slip from my sweaty palms. It hit the floor and rolled, its stark white LED beam casting wild, spinning shadows across the ceiling before wedging against the baseboard. The beam pointed sharply upward, underlighting the giant like a horrific monument as he stood before the ruined window. He dropped his massive, empty hands to his sides. For a terrifying second, he just stood there. His broad chest rose and fell in slow, rhythmic breaths beneath the snow-caked surplus parka. Freezing air from the busted front doors poured through the hole in the plexiglass, instantly turning my panicked, hyperventilating breaths into thick clouds of white vapor. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping slightly on the bloody floor. I snatched the maglite back up, gripping it like a baseball bat. "Get back!" I screamed, my voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "Get the hell away from me! I'll kill you!" He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He simply lunged forward and thrust both of his massive leather-gloved arms directly through the jagged hole. The sharp, broken edges of the polycarbonate bit deeply into his heavy coat, tearing the tough fabric with a loud rip. But he didn't care. He was reaching blindly into the cramped confines of the booth. I swung the maglite with everything I had left, bringing it down hard on his left forearm. The heavy metal connected with a dull thud. But hitting that thick, insulated parka was like hitting a truck tire. He didn't even grunt.
His right hand continued its sweeping, violent search until thick, leather-clad fingers found my shoulder. They slid upward and closed like an iron vise around the thick collar of my work shirt and the fabric of my undershirt. The grip was impossibly, terrifyingly strong. With a single brutal jerk, he hauled me forward, violently slamming my chest and face against the interior of the ruined window. Jagged plastic sliced into my cheek, hot and stinging. I choked, dropping the flashlight as his massive hand twisted my collar tight against my windpipe, completely cutting off my air. My vision instantly began to swim with black spots as my boots left the floor. He was pulling me through the jagged hole. He was dragging me out into the dark.
Black spots swarmed my vision, thick and heavy. The pressure on my windpipe was absolute, crushing the cartilage, sealing off my lungs entirely. The giant was hauling me through the jagged crater of the plexiglass like a rag doll. Sharp, broken edges of polycarbonate sliced through my work shirt, biting deep into my ribs and stomach. But the pain was distant, muted by the roaring in my ears. I kicked wildly, my boots slamming uselessly against the heavy steel door of the booth. My right hand flailed across the cramped counter, sweeping away loose pens and heavy rolls of quarters in a desperate, blind search. My fingers brushed something cold, heavy, and metallic. The industrial box cutter we used for breaking down frozen syrup boxes. I didn't have the leverage or the dexterity to slide the razor out. I just wrapped my fist around the heavy casing, exposing the tiny, sharp corner of the blade that always protruded, and drove it with every ounce of my fading strength directly into the tiny sliver of exposed skin between the giant's heavy leather glove and the wet cuff of his parka. He didn't scream, but a sudden, deep, vibrating grunt erupted from beneath his frozen ski mask. His grip spasmed, loosening just enough for gravity to take over. I tore myself backward, ripping my own collar, and collapsed onto the bloody, freezing floor of the cage. I scrambled backward like a crab, gasping violently, the freezing air burning my oxygen-starved lungs like swallowed glass. I pressed my spine against the back wall, clutching the box cutter, aiming it at the jagged hole. But the giant didn't reach back in. The temperature inside the store had plummeted to match the sub-zero nightmare outside. The wind howled through the busted double doors, whipping a vortex of snow directly down the center aisle. Out in the dark, the drifter was sobbing, a pathetic wet, gurgling sound as he clutched his mangled wrist. The giant stood at the broken window for what felt like an eternity. His heavy, ragged breathing plumed in the ambient scatter of the dropped flashlight. I waited for him to tear the door off its hinges, but the cold was the ultimate equalizer. Standing in negative 20 degrees, soaking wet, with a bleeding partner, meant death. Slowly, the giant turned. He reached down into the dark, hauled the whimpering drifter up by the scruff of his thin denim jacket, and dragged him toward the exit. I listened to the crunch of their boots on the snow-covered linoleum, fading into the howling wind. A minute later, the dull roar of the sedan's engine sputtered to life. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the blinding snow, before the car slowly reversed and was completely swallowed by the whiteout. The agonizing wait for dawn was a psychological torture I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I huddled in the corner of the cage, shivering so violently my teeth chipped, clutching that box cutter until my hands cramped into claws. The flashlight died around 4 a.m., plunging me into total darkness. In that freezing black void, every shifting shadow, every settling pipe, every groan of the wind sounded exactly like wet boots squeaking on linoleum. I was convinced they were just waiting outside, watching me freeze. When the weak gray light of morning finally broke through the storm, the store looked like a war zone. Smashed glass, frozen blood, and snowdrifts piled high inside the aisles. It was another 3 hours before a county sheriff's SUV, equipped with heavy tire chains, finally crunched into the lot. They never found them.
The car had no plates, and the blizzard had buried their tracks before they even reached the highway. It's been years since I worked in night shift. I live in the city now, on the 4th floor, but I still can't be in a brightly lit room at night without pulling the blinds tight. Whenever the wind howls, I still hear that rhythmic cap on the glass, and I still know with absolute, paralyzing certainty that just beyond the light, someone is always watching.